Welcome back to another episode of the ABC Music Talk podcast. In this episode, I continue with the basics category, taking a look at the world of physical products. In an ever-increasing digital-first industry, many people, especially those who grew up as consumers during the download era, aren't always aware of just how important and significant, and indeed viable, physical products can be to an artist's output. But before we get started, I'd like to remind you about my sponsor, Rota. Rota is for artists, managers, labels, or anyone in the music industry who needs to create video content for promotion or monetization. Rota makes it fast, easy, and inexpensive to do all of that in one place. Head to www.abcmusic.co and click the Rota logo on the homepage to access a 10% off discount for the service. So back to the show. My guest this week is the first person I thought of to talk about the world of physical. Not only is his company SRD the international partner to my client Empire for physical, but he's also my neighbour and long-suffering friend. Welcome to the show, Andy Slocombe.
Thanks.
was that a pretty good introduction?
I wasn't sure how you were going to introduce me.
Well, I was thinking about talking. So this podcast is 15 episodes in. And originally you and I were supposed to do a podcast together.
Correct.
So the origin...
I still hope we will.
Well, indeed, but we're going to call it something else because obviously, this is now mine and mine only.
Yeah, well, ours will be better.
Well, undoubtedly. This, you were sort of around at the genesis of... The idea of podcasting coming into my life, so I'm thrilled that we're finally getting to do one, given that we do literally live a stone's throw from each other.
It's taken us far too long.
It really has. I mean, in fact, so we've known each other about 5 years?
I think it's 5-6 years.
5 or 6 years. It was something like that. I couldn't quite work it out, but
feels like a long time.
Well, yeah, and also, I think we first met when I poached a member of your staff, didn't I?
We first met prior to you poaching a member of my staff, but you met that member of staff as I was considering moving our digital business to you, which of course I ended up not doing. Because you poached that member of staff.
Yeah, I know. Well, we're just trying to forget that I'm just terrible at selling stuff.
That I think poaching the member of staff in question was something I didn't stand in the way of, and it was the right thing for you, and it was the right thing for her. But I still resent you for it.
And shout out to Nisha if you're listening, because you're awesome.
Yeah.
So anyway, I just thought that was a funny memory from back then. So you heard me introduce this and talk about. This question around viability for and the opportunities for physical, and I suppose my first question is perhaps how have you seen it work best? And you can kind of pick big artists or small artists or kind of anywhere in between, just to sort of give people a flavour of kind of how physical can be a component to the release campaign.
For certain labels, it's absolutely critical, and when we're talking about physical, I should add that foremost in my mind is vinyl rather than CD, as vinyl is a critical part of every release that we have that has a physical format. A fair number don't have a CD format these days. Some even come out on cassette. I'll reserve my thoughts on those.
What, cassettes?
Yes. There's a cassette revival. People have attempted a cassette revival.
Isn't there a cassette day in the UK?
There is a cassette store day in the UK. I think I've said enough, but you can figure my position on anybody that participates in that.
Yeah, right.
On any level.
Okay, fair enough.
It's a terrible, unwieldy format that's impractical and unsatisfying on every level.
Yeah, I mean, for a while it's sort of had a place in being out home recording before CD bars.
The Walkman in the mid '80s, are we talking?
Yeah, right. There was a window.
It was a narrow window though.
Yeah,
there's no place for it in the year 2020. Is there?
Undoubtedly.
This century, never mind.
Although, what did I send you today? That little Viz thing.
You did.
What did it say?
But that was a tongue-in-cheek reference to
from Viz.
How
could it possibly be?
Well, everything from Viz is tongue-in-cheek, but it was the suggestion that vinyl enthusiasts should revert to the more aesthetically pleasing? Or
no, it's to save space. Upgrade your vinyl for vinyl enthusiasts.
It's a compact disc, so the name is in the name of the format. But once you view them as digital storage devices, which is all they are, you don't need them because they need occupy no space whatsoever, and there is nothing satisfying about them, unlike vinyl. I should add that I have far too many CDs.
Well, so I am, as you guys, anyone who knows my podcast, I do a little sort of like promo video, and you will get to see some of Andy's. We're at his house, and so some of his vinyl collection. I might also then take some shots of your CD collection just to demonstrate how many CDs you do have, because it's kind of ridiculous.
I do have a lot of CDs, but they are vastly outnumbered by the vinyl. The wall of vinyl that you see behind me now.
That is true, but you also have an internet connection, so therefore you have access to a digital copy of the same music without the need to. There's a lot of space being taken.
I'm also extremely choosy about what I keep, and I have regular purges. So what you see is the refined CD collection.
I mean, it's in some ways
still far too
in some ways what we're talking about here is you as a music fan, right, and the importance or relevance to physical products in your personal life, as opposed to like somebody who's just sort of peddling this stuff.
Well, I think I speak for almost everybody at SRD. We work there for that reason. It's not a job that becomes an interest. It's a hobby, an obsession. Mm-hmm. In many cases, possibly mine, that gets under your skin. I was going to say takes over your life, but that makes it sound as though it's not something you have control over. It's a conscious decision. It's something that, I'm thinking of 2 or 3 of my colleagues at the moment. We've grown up with it, and it's all we know.
Yeah.
And it's one of 2 constants in my life. The other one being football, and I was never good enough at that. But I have no musical talent whatsoever, but I've got a keen ear and an insatiable enthusiasm and love for it. And I haven't answered your question.
No, I had remembered that you hadn't answered the question, because you are notoriously bad for not answering my questions.
That's sometimes conscious. But I guess it's already apparent that we're likely to veer off the subjects in hand.
That does seem
throughout,
to be
however long this lasts.
The general theme of our relationship.
It does indeed. Infuriating for others.
Undoubtedly. That's why no one else hangs around with us.
Yeah, it probably is. Yeah. The physical format is the priority for a fair number of our labels, and that's not to say that digital isn't important to them, but they see themselves, and we have 200 or so active suppliers, and within that, 4 or 5 of those suppliers house between 20 and 50 labels each. Yeah. So we have a vast number of labels and a varied bed of labels, and it obviously varies from genre to genre where their priorities lie and what they feel is the most important format to each of their releases. So I would say, I'm thinking about. Do you want me to name specific labels?
No, you can do. I've just thought something that I haven't asked you, which I should have asked you at the beginning. But before I do that, are you kind of getting at the idea that a label, the sorts of labels that clients of SRD know their audience well enough to know what they should be providing them with?
I think the labels are of a mind similar to ours, which is you instantly know which way a particular release will lean. You know whether it's worthy of a CD format, which suits a certain type or level of release. Mm-hmm. Increasingly few, I should add. And you also know where the bias will lie with regard to physical versus digital. Mm-hmm. We have a decent number of digital-only labels and some very significant digital-only labels. But you can almost... It's impossible to put your finger on, but it is something that you can aesthetically pick up based on the genre, I suppose. There are certain genres that lean more heavily towards it. I would say, as a rule of thumb, the more commercial a release, the more towards digital and CD it leans, and the more specialist a release, the more it leans towards vinyl. But that's by no means limited to one or two genres. Soundtracks spring to mind, where the vinyl format is absolutely the leading format, the most important format. And on our dance labels, I'm thinking about Tresor, which is strong for digital, but as Tresor, which, if you're unaware, is the leading techno label in the world, and has been since 1989, I think 90. They have an anniversary coming up. It must be 90. Right. With Tresor, I think that even though there is a significant digital audience for it, the fact that it's so heavily leaning towards physical is people like myself. As in 1990, I was 17, I was at college, and I was buying Tresor records.
Yeah, right.
And techno, for me, more than any genre, is absolutely timeless. And the records that they release now, as they A&R things so well, it's not that it hasn't progressed as a genre, it's more that it could have come out in 1990, it could be something new now, and you can spin that around and look at their catalogue and switch any of it around to any stage in the label's life, and none of it would sound particularly dated or ahead of its time. It's just a genre that operates outside of everything else and has aged so well that you can almost not pinpoint it. But I think for people like myself, it's a genre and a label that you want on vinyl. It automatically leads you to the vinyl.
Yeah,
and
sure.
I think if we were to granularly analyse this, people that are buying Tresor digital releases are probably buying the vinyl as well. A fair number of them.
Right.
CD, not so relevant for most of their releases.
Sure. I mean, as a company, I know that working with you, a large part of what you do actually is advise your clients what the viability is for certain products. That feels like we come to you because you have a good feel for the market. You've also got access to people who have a more granular feel for the market, whether that's territory-based shops or niche genre, whatever.
I think an important part of what we do, maybe the most important part of what we do, is, as you say, to advise our labels. Yeah. What we will never do, because it benefits nobody, is recklessly or speculatively encourage any of our labels, recognising that they're all really operating on limited budgets because they're all entirely independent, as we are. I mean, there's one or two exceptions to that, of course, which are fairly obvious. Yeah. But for labels that are operating on limited budgets, we will never encourage them to enter into anything that we don't think stacks up. So that can either be the vinyl manufacturer or the CD manufacturer itself. It can then be the quantities that we're encouraging them to manufacture. We would rather it would sell out and generate an immediate financial return than over-manufacture. We throw out as much stock as we can, consign it, and keep our fingers crossed that it sells through. Obviously, there's an element of that, and you can never guarantee that shipped units will turn into sales. But we would never consciously encourage people based on what we might benefit most from. We would rather a release is, generally speaking, under-manufactured, that the demand is gauged as accurately as possible, as far enough in advance as possible, and that we are looking at something that's sold out fairly instantly, generating immediate revenue and bankrolling the next release.
Yeah, right. There were a couple of words in there that are sort of kind of industry jargon, but I have a question about that later on. So consignment.
I'm trying to avoid those. Consignment.
No, but I want to get into them because it's important. So because it's part of the mystery of it, actually. And but before I do that, can we go back to the question that I was supposed to ask you at the beginning?
Didn't I answer the question?
No, you absolutely did. And I didn't ask you to tell me a bit about SRD, but if you can do that also, because I know it's such a large part of your career, can you do that as part of your path to getting to where you are today? Because it began in the most sort of I don't know, like sort of romantic version of getting into the music industry, which was beginning in a record shop, right?
Yeah, although not an indie. I never worked for an indie, but I live in Essex, and I could count on one hand the number of indies that I can ever remember at any point in Essex. And Essex is big, and there were a couple of indie chains back when I was in my college days, which are long since defunct. Trumps and BBs, which had shops in places that you could never imagine record shops now, like Hornchurch or Southwood and Ferrers or places like that would never justify a music retailer now.
Yeah.
Basildon and Grays and places like that,
Sure.
It just doesn't make any sense. But there are important indies back then as well, I should add, like Boogie Times in Romford, which people still reference these days as being one of the key stores in the inception of jungle drum and bass old school.
Oh, right.
Linked in some way to Ram Records, which is a label we've worked with for many years as well,
very cool,
which is
yeah.
still going and still based close to where we are. I worked for, my first job in music retail was for a company called Foreplay, which is very amusing. I think the gag was that it was for play
Right.
rather than for work.
Got it.
It was the number 4, and then the Bishop Lane Prince 4. I think he started all of that, and then the word play, and they were relatively short-lived. Although I don't think I contributed directly to their demise. There's a story behind it,
I'm
but
sure there is.
they were Independent Store of the Year for Music Week for 2 or 3 years in a row, around the time that Andy's were around as an independent chain as well. Then I went to work for HMV in Lakeside. I worked there for 6 months or so as singles buyer. It didn't end especially well. I then, shortly after that, went to work for Virgin in Basildon, and then back to Our Price at Lakeside when Virgin and Our Price were one company. And when that came to an end, I applied for the telesales position at SRD that I started in September, the first weekend of September 1997. My thunder stolen somewhat by the accident involving Lady Di that happened that weekend.
Oh, right.
No one remembers my first day at SRD. They just remember that. No one talks about it. Anyway,
that's utterly tragic.
but that was that same weekend. Yeah, overshadowed somewhat.
Yeah, well,
I still feel the injustice of that. Anyway, so
you still feel the loss. Is that what you're saying?
I'm saying that means something else to me, but only to me. I started there September 97. I worked in telesales, which is an entry level role, for around a year. I applied myself as I have to any job I've ever done, even my shelf stacking days when I was a Saturday boy when I was at college.
Yeah.
Which is with diligence and enthusiasm and some pride in my work.
Good.
Thank you.
Well, it's a lesson for those out there listening.
Oh well, the lesson is, of course, that whatever you're doing and whatever you're being paid and however much you care about the task in hand, do your best.
Absolutely.
That's a slightly old-fashioned notion, I guess, but I then moved up to becoming a van rep, which I don't think they exist for anybody anymore. I guess someone out there will put me straight on that, but I think maybe PS still have one.
Yeah.
I don't know how it's viable. There were enough indies in England to justify a van rep, but far too broad a geographical base to make it viable.
Yeah.
Whereas back then, I filled a week comfortably by covering the chains in central London 1 day a week, the indies in central London, so Rough Trade Covent Garden, Rough Trade West, Section 5, which was Moving Shadows shop on King's Road.
And this is in a van going into a shop, speaking to the buyer or the owner, and going, Hey.
Literally driving round to the shops with a van full of records, going through the week's pre-sales, but also being able to offer restock replenishment instantly.
Amazing.
The other 2 days of the week, I covered Oxford, Reading, Cambridge, Bedford, Milton Keynes, and it's easily, even though I only did it for a year, easily the best job I've ever had. I absolutely loved that job.
Yeah.
I loved the freedom of it. I loved the face-to-face aspects of it. I enjoyed driving, which helped. But yeah, I was obviously doing it too well, because I was then offered the role of National Accounts Manager. And the lure of progress and a little extra money was enough. I then took on what was perhaps the most challenging job I've ever had, and I include my current position in that, as it was a trying role at a trying time, and there was a hell of a lot of pressure. And it's not to say I couldn't handle the pressure, but it was several levels up from what I was used to.
Right.
I spent 5 years or so doing that. Hopefully this is going to add up to 22 when I tally all of these times I've spent doing these jobs.
I'd like to say I'm keeping count. I'm not keeping count. And
we're up to 7 now.
Oh, okay. Thank you.
I spent 5 years doing national accounts. I was dealing with the head offices of Virgin, HMV, Play.com, Amazon.
So this is this is like the birth of digital without it being digital.
Well, that's why there was so much pressure on the role, because it was a period of change.
Yeah. Right.
So we're talking 99 to 2004. I think I did that.
Okay.
And
yeah, iTunes launched in 2003.
My predecessor, it may be up to 2005 that I was doing it, but my predecessor in my current directorial position, I think we can all acknowledge, wasn't on point with the rise of digital from the start, and as such, we were playing catch up for a fair amount of time. Sure. As he clearly didn't think it was going to take off the way it has. From
a company services point of view.
Yeah. And our digital operation to begin with was, laughable if you look back. And that's one of the first things I changed when I took over the company.
And more of that in a moment. Might I add, you and everybody else, it was so difficult. I talked a little bit about this on the last podcast about this sort of concept of change, and the industry had gone from having the best time of its life ever with the CD boom to almost overnight kind of really starting to feel the effects of digital media on the business collectively. And of course physical distribution and often manufacturing was a key sort of component to that.
Yeah, granted it did seem to creep up on everybody, but certain labels and other distributors were more reactive to that rather than dismissive. Absolutely.
But there were bigger companies in SRD that didn't last. They didn't make it.
Yeah, I'm sure, and that no doubt contributed to their downfall. But I look back at the naivety in some of the label contracts that I inherited, and how they were allowed to auto-renew with just physical, even when we had a digital operation to speak of, and that at none of those contractual terms was there any foresight to rewrite the contracts and roll in the digital, which left us vulnerable to...
Was it just the contracts, or was it also like a kind of like an education or an awareness in the business to try and nail that down?
I think even when there was the awareness, even when we'd started to take it seriously, and when I say we, I don't necessarily mean myself, but my predecessor, who was pulling those strings then, I think it was a stubbornness more than anything else, and I think it was the refusal to acknowledge it. So we found ourselves with labels that we were carrying digitally, and those labels were free to take the digital elsewhere with no contractual responsibility to us.
Right.
Simply because it had never been included in their contracts. And yes, we've been carrying their digital products, but when they say we would like to take our digital elsewhere, you look at the contracts and discover that it's only included physical ever, even though we've been distributing their digital for years.
Yeah, yeah.
And then you have other labels, and Hospital spring to mind, who were way ahead of the game, way ahead of the curve.
Oh yeah, for sure.
Never needed anybody else to do it.
Yeah. Yeah, there's a few of those labels that really kind of got it.
I mean, you could say that about Hospital in every regard, really. They've always been extremely forward-thinking.
One of the most impressive indie labels in the UK.
Very much so, yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So, having looked after national accounts, how did we get onto that? Having looked after national accounts for 5-6 years, it was a turning point,
yep.
And it was a period of change, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I then took over as sales manager, so took on the responsibility of effectively managing the positions that I previously occupied, apart from Van Rep, which was redundant by then, and looking after the export side myself, and that took us up to 2012.
Mm-hmm.
2011, summer of 2011. And in the summer of 2011, myself as one of 3 department heads at the time, Steve, who was another one, head of accounts, we had the opportunity to take over the business. So almost 8.5 years ago now, we did that.
Amazing.
And we've made some big changes in that time.
Well, I have questions about that. So can you just very quickly introduce SRD as a company, because it's obviously it's got history prior to you getting there.
Yeah, SRD was built in 1987, I believe. It was originally set up to distribute the Jungle label that my predecessor had a hand in the running of. That's not Jungle the genre, that's Jungle the punk label with Johnny Thunder, Ziggy Pop, and others of that ilk. Still going to this day, and still going strong to this day. Mm-hmm. The other arm of the company back then, and the subject of some confusion, as we were always separate entities, was Southern Studios. Mm-hmm. So the S in SRD is for Southern. Southern Studios were the anarcho-punk label group studios in Wood Green, and we distributed their labels for many, many years until, I would say, 10-12 years ago, somewhere around that now. And they were mostly American labels, most notably Discord, who are still with us to this day, and as much our backbone as any label, with Fugazi and Minor Threat, and artists that have shaped guitar music from Nirvana onwards, really. So that's the history of the company. So the company had been running for 10 years by the time I joined. We brought through jungle drum and bass from nothing, from nowhere, around, I guess, 1991. In the late 90s, we did the same with dubstep. We were putting out Horsepower Productions records on Temper when it wasn't a thing, when dubstep wasn't a thing, and ended up with Scream and Benga records and, artists that went on to much, much bigger things on major labels generally. We did the same with grime, as dubstep kind of fizzled out a little bit.
Yeah.
But it still exists, but nothing like what it was. With grime, we were putting out Roll Deep and Skepta and Wiley albums and gigs and Chipmunk. Again, before grime was really recognised. Mm-hmm. What have we brought through since then? We need something else to follow those up with, don't we? Anyway, we do what we do very well.
I mean, you might be doing it already and you just don't know yet, because a lot of that stuff, kind of to your point about dubstep, before it was dubstep, you didn't know you were doing it, right?
Maybe we'll be looking back and saying SRD were the first to start re-releasing cassettes.
I think, given your sort of preface on that, probably not.
If people want to buy them, we'll distribute them and we'll sell them to people.
Well, I mean, ultimately you're a company that is a supply and demand based business, right?
Well, more than that, if we have a label that's under contract to us and they want to release cassettes, we're duty bound to do so for them.
Indeed, yeah, very true, very true. Despite any protests you might have. So speaking about kind of sort of strategies, I suppose, to diving into doing something physical, because I think there's a little bit of sort of people want to do it now because it's got some nostalgia value or it's a collectibles thing, etc., etc. Like these are like sort of peripheral reasons for sometimes having a physical component. Not always, as you pointed out with Trezor and other labels, right? But for some people, that is now what it's become. And that's been, as part of that sort of vinyl revival type of thing. But what I wanted to ask you about was where we've talked about change and we've talked about that sort of, that almost switch over that you experienced as somebody who worked in the industry. There was a period of time during the download era where download cards were being put into vinyl as like codes, so that people could get a digital copy of the physical product that they bought, and that was kind of seen, at least by I think probably retail as much as distribution and record labels themselves, as a sort of a way of saving the existing business to sort of keep it going a little bit longer. What have you seen anything sort of happen since to kind of continue to sort of match that physical to digital thing?
That's still fairly common. We have download cards in a fair number of our releases.
Right.
Or codes, but either way, access to the digital format to encourage you to buy the physical. And as it feels unfair to a vinyl buyer to not have the obvious digital format available to you for your whatever listening device you choose to use, it seems only fair that you get a digital version if you're buying the vinyl, given the financial commitment that comes with doing so.
I guess one of the things you could do is if you had, say, an exclusive track list on the physical product, like say an extra mix, or even just perhaps a behind the scenes bit of audio or something, perhaps that download card could be access to a digital version of that which isn't available on Spotify.
Yeah, but it would seem mercenary to try to force a loyal punter to buy more than one format. Even
though the record industry made a great, a large part of the business is based on that. I've told you my feeder story.
Yes, you have indeed. Yeah. Let's not talk about that again. What I don't see happening as often, but which was a thing for a period of time, was a sleeveless CD in with the vinyl.
Right.
That used to happen a lot. And I never really see that now.
Yeah, okay.
I suppose it's not practical to manufacture a CD unless there's a CD format, but maybe if you are doing a CD and vinyl format, then putting a sleeveless CD in there does make a bit more sense. But you're not going to manufacture a CD when there is otherwise no CD format, are you?
Yeah. Any other kind of examples of how you've seen, maybe it's nothing like to do with actually sort of like directly linking the digital to the physical, but in one of the things that you and I talk about when we're doing our normal day jobs is making sure that the street dates align.
Yeah,
because
I mean it's sorry.
If you've got a fan base that may also buy a physical product as well as listening to it on a streaming service, then having it hit at the same time, because if you've got marketing drivers going on to obviously raise awareness around the fact that this album or CD, album or EP or single, whatever is out, then missing that is a direct way of sort of unlinking the two. So by just simply putting things out on the same street date allows you to talk about two things. It
makes absolute sense to do so. And clearly it will have a detrimental effect to whichever format is the late format if you aren't able to achieve that. I don't quite get how, with enough forward planning, it's not always achievable. But it isn't always achievable, and you've got to recognise that it, from a retailer's point of view, from a physical retailer's point of view, it makes the support of that release far less attractive, knowing that everyone's already heard it if the digital's already been out for a week, a month, however long. So these are things that should always be aligned, or indeed turned on their head, and the vinyl coming out before the digital.
Absolutely, yeah.
Which is something that some people consciously do.
That in a sort of a digital version of that, you used to find, when streaming was still considered a bit of a a no-no for some artists. They would put out the physical and they would put out the download because it was the purchase aspect to it.
Yeah.
Before the streaming, and they would window, using there's a bit of terminology there. Just windowing just means separating, periods of time. But and that was a real thing for a year or so, wasn't it? Like consciously, yeah. Some big artists were doing that.
Yeah.
To kind of separate the two. So so in terms of like linking digital to physical, that's actually quite a good idea when you think about it, because you're able to talk about the album release in the context of there's a perhaps a limited edition vinyl, or just a unique thing with something inside, or whatever it is that you're wanting to talk about, that you can get before you're going to be able to get this on Spotify, or Apple Music or Amazon or whatever.
But far more often it happens the other way around, where the digital comes out before the physical.
I mean, this is why I wanted to talk about it with you, because you remember from the time before even digital, let alone streaming. And I think that
47 this month.
A lot of thank you for that. A lot of the executives that are in the music industry now are not thinking about physical, unless it's somebody's gone, hey, you know what, we should do an anniversary vinyl for something, and like, oh, okay, yeah, that sounds cool, but it's not like there's no real point to it other than it's a sort of special one-off thing. Whereas actually maybe you've got a fan base that may well actually purchase something and actually wants something like that, and so then when it comes to planning that release, they're not conscious of lead times and other things.
No, I think even the most suspicious or wary, or indeed unaware of the viability of vinyl, have caught onto it now.
Mm-hmm.
And you only need to look at Record Store Day and the impact that's had.
That's true.
And the increasing bias towards major label product, to illustrate just how much it's appeared on everybody's radar.
From a manufacturing point of view.
Record Store Day is something we can talk about in more detail if you want.
Yeah,
but,
absolutely. Well, it's a big event now.
It is a big event, and we have more releases this year than I think we've had any previous Record Store Day, although it's not something that we dictate. It's our labels that dictate the releases that they have. And yes, of course, we'll facilitate and work whatever comes our way, and try to maximise the coverage and profile of everything that comes our way on any of our labels. But when it comes to Record Store Day, the vast majority of what we have every year sells out, and not only sells out, but is massively oversubscribed, which creates a whole world of pain for me one afternoon.
So perhaps, like, just I don't know, I have no idea if everybody listening to this is completely aware of what Record Store Day even is necessarily. So just very sort of quickly do that, and then talk about some of the challenges.
Yeah, Record Store Day is a day that's been in the calendar for, I'd guess, around 12 years now. Somewhere. I was
going to say 10, but I think you might be right with 12.
Where the indies have a range of exclusive releases. So these are releases that are entirely exclusive to them, that are not sold on HMV, not sold on Amazon, and indeed not sold to stores that are not bricks and mortar. So stores that are web store only, and that there are slightly more relaxed arrangements for a core few who have fought their corner fairly successfully, and all credit to them for doing so. But the premise of Record Store Day is that you go to your local record store and queue up in order to get one of only a handful of copies that any of those stores will have on Record Store Day. Clearly it's open to vultures, and that's something that the stores have to control. So by only allowing a certain number of copies of anything to be bought by one person, rather than whoever's first in the queue buying every copy and then multiplying the price and putting it on Discogs that night. So that is not what it's for, but it's very difficult to prevent as well.
Yeah, of course.
I don't know how many releases they have this year. Did someone say 750? Have I heard 750? There's an extraordinary number of releases this year.
That's amazing.
And you look at the nature of those releases and the musical bias has changed significantly since year 1, up to year 5 probably.
Yeah.
And now you look at how ridiculously commercial some of the releases are. It's almost childish to pick certain names, but I remember last year there was a Paloma Faith record, and I mean, it's okay, she's got her followers, but it's not what Record Store Day is about.
Yeah, it seems unnecessary to force one into that.
Why does she need to be part of it? Why do established acts need to, I don't know, I suppose that's slightly flawed in that you still want to give your audience something to cherish, however established you are, but it feels extremely cynical when it's somebody as high profile as that doesn't really have a defined vinyl audience. For me, it's not what Record Store Day is about, but my primary bugbears with Record Store Day, when it's been a very good thing, are that maybe there's a statistician somewhere that can prove this wrong, but my suspicion, having participated in it for so many years, is that it doesn't generate any extra revenue for anybody, because your average member of the public doesn't have more money in their pocket. You don't have a bigger budget because RSDs come around, but what you will do is stockpile the money in your pocket and save it for Record Store Day. So if you're thinking of releasing anything in the 2-3 weeks immediately prior, you might want to reschedule it.
Right.
Back catalogue slows down completely. Stores don't have the budget to spend because they too are saving their budget to spend on RSD releases. You have stores that only ever order for Record Store Day, and while that is valuable to a point, they'll always be at the back of the queue, because I feel a duty to support the stores that support us week in, week out, rather than those that rear their heads on the rare occasion that they know that we've got something that they can definitely sell, rather than, you know, offering year-round support.
Yeah, because it's
second-hand shops do that
for
Record Store Day. That only ever second-hand all year round.
Interesting. So I mean that you're touching on something that I haven't written a question about. We could talk about it, which is sort of in this decline in physical importance, if you like, to the commercial aspect of the music industry. The Record Store Day is a product of the sort of community that's built up around distributors as much as record shops, as much as the record labels and artists that kind of get involved with it.
Yeah.
And you were just kind of talking there a little bit about something where for some people this is like it's their life, and they they invest in it and they love it, and it's very dear to them.
Yeah.
Whereas some people, I guess what we're talking about is the fact that some people just see it as an opportunity to just sell a few more units of something.
Yeah, but it's, everything's open to manipulation, isn't it? And you hope that people would enter into the spirit of it and not see it as a cynical opportunity. But as I say, that's something that we have to manage when a release is limited. Then we look after the people that we know we can count on, rather than stores that you don't hear from all year.
Yeah.
You have certain criteria you need to satisfy with ERA, who put the list of RSD stores together. ERA,
Entertainment Retailers Association.
Correct. And as such, it's not as though anyone and everyone is allowed to participate. And really, you would hope that the entry criteria is reasonable, because you want this to be something that's good for the independent stores. HMV in recent years have argued a case that they should be allowed to participate as well, certainly where they are the only record shop in any particular town. And if I were HMV, I would argue the same. But I think it would meet with a great deal of resistance from a lot of people. Yeah,
I get it. So shift gears slightly. Can we talk about chart rules for a minute? Well, charts in general have arguably had a sort of diminishing value to people because they've got more complicated, because we're having to bring in all these different formats, streaming, whether that's paid for, or whether it's ad based, whether it's got is it a video stream or is it just audio, as much as downloads, as much, and then physical inside as well. And you've obviously got the difference between selling something rather than consuming something, I suppose. But like for physical, can you just sort of explain some of the rules that are sort of inhibit something, whether it's kind of whether it would qualify even for the album chart rule, for example, album chart.
Well,
because of course you could just put as much stuff as you could into a container and sell it just to hype the charts, but you can't because
we have very few labels that would allow their release cycle, or indeed the release itself, to be dictated by the chart rules.
Mm-hmm.
And yes, there are some, and yes, there are certain releases on certain labels, but generally it's of very little importance. It's vanity and nothing more.
Mm-hmm.
More so, it's about coverage being as comprehensive as possible, your records being in the right quantities in the right places, and selling those units.
Right. And
if that, amounts to a chart position, then I don't think anybody feels that that's unwelcome. But I'm not sure it has a great deal of importance to anybody either.
To your labels.
To our labels, yeah.
Okay.
I don't think it's their. I don't think it's their world. I don't think it's their realm, and it's certainly not foremost in their thinking when they're scheduling a release.
Right.
There are exceptions, but they are the exceptions.
Fair enough. Okay, so I've touched on this earlier about some of the language, and you and I have recently had a conversation about how for you, because you've been doing it so long, some of the language is just second nature. You're not even thinking about it when you're using acronyms or words to describe a particular situation. I mean, that I think for anyone who, if you're a young, and this podcast is aimed at people coming into the industry, they just won't have had the benefit of being able to have had that sort of sales job or intern job at a physical distribution company to learn any of this stuff. So if they were at a later point in their career needing to get involved with it, is the language, I mean, do you think people would find it difficult to even contemplate getting something set up and indeed understand how successful something's being? Because talk through some of the words, like use the word consignment earlier. Explain that.
Yeah, consignment is a line of supply where you are shipping the stock to a partner,
mm-hmm.
Or a chain,
mm-hmm.
and there is no financial value to that shipment until the unit is sold. So, for example, if you are a chain store that's on consignment terms, you could order 500 of a new CD release from us. As long as we had the stock, we would ship those units to you. If we were tight on stock, we might cut that back, because shipping all of the stock on consignment at the expense of actual sales might not make any sense, and that's one of our duties to our labels. But if I shipped 500 copies of a CD to a chain store, the chain would not owe me for any of those until a member of the public went in and bought one.
Right.
And only then does it translate into an invoice.
Yeah.
We operate on those terms with our overseas distribution partners in every key territory,
mm-hmm.
whereby we present the releases to them. They order the quantities that they feel their market requires. We'll run the rule over those before we decide how many we're happy for them to have, on the premise that stock is generally fairly limited, and as such a spread of stock makes far more sense than putting it all in one place.
Mm-hmm.
And they would then report to us the number of units that they've sold each month. We would then invoice them for that number of units.
Mm-hmm.
we work with partners who generally would rather order conservatively and reorder than order blindly, and we, in the rare exceptions to that, we are fairly wise to it, I like to think.
Yeah.
And as such, we'll decide how many they get. But that's how consignment works, and to look at that from the other angle, those are the terms on which all of our labels supply us. So if you have a label and you have 10,000 units and you're shipping those to me, we don't owe you for those until we sell them.
Yeah.
And keep in mind, of course, that we may be reconsigning them. So you could send me 10,000 units on consignment. I don't owe you anything until they're sold. I could be spreading those around the UK, elsewhere, on consignment terms. We may have none left, but we still don't owe you a penny until any of those partners are selling those units through.
Do you have any shops or partners that are firm sale when they order?
All of the UK indies are firm sale. I mean, firm sale is slightly nuanced. That is generally interpreted to mean non-consignment, as in immediately invoiced, but it can also mean non-returnable. But I think in this sense you mean non-consignment.
Well, so this is where I'm getting to, right? So I think that, because when I've stepped through this process before, you get people, and this isn't necessarily you, right? But other companies that I've worked with, and they'll go, yeah, we've shipped a certain number, and you're like, okay, but what does that mean? And they go, well, we've shipped some, and okay, but how much of that was consignment? How much of that was firm sale? And if it was firm sale, am I going to see any of those again? Right? Yeah. And this is where I feel like somebody who has never really worked properly on the physical side of things. I'm not on that side of it. I made compilation albums that were put on CD and were never on digital necessarily, right? So I was kind of coming at it from that side of things, but I never had to deal with kind of boxes of stuff particularly until a little bit later on. But when I did get into it, it was like, this is super complicated. Like, it's hard to understand what's going on.
Yeah. Was there a question in there?
This is the basics category, so it's meant to try and sort of like unearth some of that stuff. So, so we've covered consignment. We're talking about the confusion that happens around a number that you're given by your physical distribution partner that is the ship number, and how that can be divided up. Consignment's one of them. Firm sale, but firm sale can mean both effectively consignment and...
We do have overseas accounts. Generally, stores are firm sale, distribution partners and one notable chain are consignment. But as I say, while those terms are clearly not as favourable for independent stores, because they are the ones that are on firm sale, consignment terms aren't as much of a benefit as it might seem from the outside. You might think that if you are that chain that agreed consignment terms, you're making no financial commitment to anything in any of your stores, and you only have to shell out for any individual unit at the point that someone's putting money in the till for it. But, as has become apparent, and a conversation I've had many a time, the negative for them of being on consignment terms is, if we have limited stock on something, I won't even tell them about it, because if we know something's going to sell out to the indies, we make it indies only. Right. And that means they don't even go into Amazon, who aren't on consignment terms for what it's worth, not with us anyway. Yeah. So the conversation tends to be, why haven't you told us about this release on a label that we always sell? And I will say, well, we're getting 100 copies for the UK. However, if you're prepared to take them outside of your consignment arrangement, let's have a conversation. And that's where the conversation ends every time. So, yes, consignment involves no financial commitment, but it means you are not going to be front of the queue.
Yeah, okay. Perhaps do these slightly more quick fire, just because I don't want to kind of go too much into, but the term file discounts.
File discount is something that the aforementioned chains have, so Amazon and HMV in the UK. It is an automatic percentage deduction from dealer price on everything that they buy from us.
Right.
There is an equivalent for export, although for slightly different reasons. The reason that we have an export pricing structure which amounts to the same, which is also a percentage deduction from dealer price, is to prevent our releases from being prohibitively overpriced in a domestic market, so they're able to remain competitive.
Yeah. Yes, I mean, some of these things are practical reasons, as you're pointing out. Yeah.
They are. You can, whatever the file discount, it's something that simply needs to be factored in when you're setting your prices for something. Mm-hmm. So if you're a label and you know that Amazon, HMV are going to be the biggest customer for that release, you work upwards from your manufacturer price, our distribution fee, the payback that you need, and you set the dealer price accordingly.
Yeah.
So yes, they're going to get a file discount, but often that can be a file discount on a dealer price that's higher than it would have been had nobody had any file discounts.
Mm-hmm. Next
that makes
one.
sense?
Yeah. Next one, dealer price.
Oh yeah, dealer price.
I mean, just to point out, like this is what I find
accidental jargon.
Yeah, this is what I find happens, right?
Yeah.
So there are words that are almost like the only words to describe something because it's just
Yeah.
what people use in the industry.
Yeah.
And of course, it's almost like you can't put certain sentences together without using a combination of them. So, dealer price.
Dealer price is the price that the store would pay for that unit. So there is a general rule of thumb conversion that takes you from dealer price to retail price, which is times 1.7, although some would work to times 2.0 seemingly, and some are perhaps more aggressive with their pricing and try to undercut everybody else. But the price that you see something on the shelves for is somewhere around 40% more than they are paying for it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, it's. I mean, if anyone's sitting there getting a little lost in this, I'm in the same boat.
But
I do this for a living.
But let me add to that particularly when you're looking at CDs,
yeah,
more than any other format, maybe not digital, but the manufacture cost of CDs, which is something I remember the media costing in onto 25 years ago. They only cost this much to manufacture, and this is what you pay for them.
That's right. Yeah.
There's a significant markup from manufacture cost to retail price on CD.
Absolutely, yeah. Wholesale price?
Well, we don't wholesale, but that would effectively be dealer price in our world.
Right, okay. Yeah, I mean, this is the other thing. Like, some people use some terms to mean the same thing as something else.
Yeah.
It is confusing. I think we're going to leave that there. So I've only got a couple of questions left, but one I wanted to talk about because I think it's relevant and significant to this concept of change that the whole industry is continually going through. But one that you can talk about is some big changes that you made to your business in recent years. I'm talking specifically about selling the forklift truck.
Yes. Well, big changes we made to the business in my time in my current position were using and this isn't what you were talking about, but we're going to do this as well, were recognising that we needed to work with a third party for our digital rather than keeping it in-house. Acknowledging that the service we were able to offer purely with 2 in-house members of staff put us in a vulnerable position to losing the digital content we did have, as well as not being able to compete with other distributors for new labels. So recognising we needed to be able to offer more of a 360 service, we were looking at either taking on additional extra staff or working with a third party that could do that for us with us pulling their strings, which is of course how we first met.
Absolutely.
We looked at what we felt were all of the options at the time, and at every contractual turn we've done that since. The company that we went to instead of in-grooves at the time. We worked with for 2 or 3 contractual periods.
And the person that made the successful sale is somebody by the name of Lee Morrison, who was on this podcast a few episodes ago.
He never was he?
He really was, yeah.
Lee was very convincing, and we had only positive changes from our time at Believe. It was definitely the right thing to do. Why did we leave Believe as we did a few years later? Well, there's a bit more to it, but more than I should give away probably. But what I'll say is that in an area of the industry that's evolving more than any other, constantly evolving, never standing still, it feels crucial that we always survey our options, because every year, 18 months, things have changed.
Absolutely.
There are new players in the market, and how reactive those that have been around a while are is, something else you should consider as well. We've been with Idle, a French company, for 2 terms now. We're about to enter our 3rd, and everything's going fine with them.
Yeah.
But moving your digital doesn't come with the same back-breaking complications as moving your physical.
Which is...
As such, there's no reason to not do it if it's right for the business.
So, talk about that.
The physical, so a year after taking over, Steve and I had our hand forced with a warehouse move.
Sorry, Steve is
my business partner.
Thank you.
Mentioned a little earlier, but if you don't remember that, that's fine.
I wasn't listening. I never listened to you.
He was one of the 2 department heads that we got the opportunity at the time, and we've been running the business since, so for 8.5 years.
Cool.
Steve and I moved the warehouse from Tottenham to Dagenham in 2012. We signed a 10-year lease with a 5-year break, and for a year prior to the conclusion of that initial term, felt that we should look at the landscape, much as we have with digital. We were aware that we were very much in the minority in that we still hosted our own logistics, and while it was nice to have the records in the building, that's a child's reason and not necessarily a business reason. And as soon as you look at the respective costs as well as the relieving of the weight on the shoulders.
Well, it's something similar to, I think, what the internet world went through, where people used to have servers in their offices and now they don't. They use Amazon cloud services.
I guess so.
Azure and things like that.
Yeah, the same principle applies. We looked at the 2 different ways of working, and then looking at the alternative way, which is to outsource your warehousing to a third party. We looked at the options open to us and quickly established that we could not only make significant savings, but that crucially that would be for what would amount to an improvement in service. So outsourcing to the right people, and by the right people I mean a distributor much like ourselves, that has a similar product base and therefore a similar customer base. So the benefits are not only ours, but more so, if anything, for our customers, in that they are then able to consolidate their orders into one. So if you, the company that we work with are a company called Proper, they have 3 or 4 other indies under their roof, as well as their own releases. And if you think about it logically, if we all had our own warehouses, you ran a shop, you might want 5 records from each of us. You would be getting 5-6 boxes from different locations, whereas now you can get them all in one box.
It's had a positive environmental impact as well, because it's the same van that's going out the door.
There is that as well, and you know how important that is to me.
Absolutely.
But there's also the fringe benefits to all parties, that they will be able to feed off our customer base and us from theirs, and everyone else that's under their roof. And maybe you'd have looked at our sales sheets and thought, well, they have 1 record a month that I want. and it's not worth bothering with.
Yeah.
Whereas now there's no reason not to, because you are able to pick things from different shelves metaphorically and fill a box with it.
I think it's worth also pointing out that that was only really possible because of some significant changes that Proper were making at the time, and they were talking very openly to you because of something we talked about earlier, that sort of that close-knit relationships that a lot of companies in your space, if you like, the physical space, have. You all talk to each other, you're all very friendly with each other for the most part.
Drew, who is my counterpart there, I'd met several years before at MEDEM, an annual conference in south of France, and we, even though there was no prospect of us working with them then, we got on very easily whenever discussing shared experiences, of which there were many. Quickly realised that we independently arrived at the same conclusions and solutions to common situations, and that we saw eye to eye ultimately.
Yeah.
As such, he was and still is somebody that I trust.
Yeah.
And that's important as well.
Absolutely. Yeah, people. I mean, you know, you can talk about contracts all you like, but without that trust component, the relationships are very hard to manage.
I was handing something over to him that was very important to me.
Of course, yeah. But it was also a control factor, something that you controlled.
Yeah.
And you, therefore, that trust is, and it was crucial. It's a crucial part to the sort of business that you have.
But the deal had to be right.
Of course.
And I don't only mean the financials,
mm-hmm.
but I mean I was suddenly the label talking to the distributor,
mm-hmm.
the other side of the table to which I usually sit.
Mm-hmm.
As such, I was semi-familiar with the 14-page contracts. It was half of it you could cross-map with our distribution contracts with our labels. But as Drew memorably said to me at that stage, someone had said to him, Andy won't sign anything unless he understands every word in there. Mm-hmm. I went back to him with a list of either questions or clauses that I felt we needed to strike out because they either weren't relevant or weren't areas that I felt we needed to discuss or that I was prepared to discuss.
Yeah.
And what we arrived at was something that suited both parties. We are 2.5 years in now, into our first 3-year term.
Yeah.
And I am perfectly happy with them. I mean, you know, it's all too easy when you have the culture shock of not having the records in your own warehouse to pick holes and find fault, but
the bigger picture is
have had to remind some of our staff that we weren't perfect either, remember?
Yeah.
And things will go wrong whoever you work with,
mm-hmm.
but there's been nothing significant, and we have a good working relationship.
And the benefits to your business are positive, right?
Well, not least in that we were able to move to an office-only environment in a much nicer area.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I don't think you can overestimate the value of a pleasant environment and climate for people to go to work to every day.
Yeah.
That makes a big difference.
So my final question is deliberately antagonistic,
mm-hmm.
but time to get your crystal ball out. How long's physical got left for the music industry?
I don't see vinyl disappearing, ever. Ever? I don't see it disappearing. As ever in my world, ever as far as my career or awareness is concerned.
Yeah.
CD is only heading in one direction, but it still is an important format for certain releases. Will it ever disappear completely? Maybe that will last longer than everybody thinks, because it is still a cost-effective format, mm-hmm. and there is still a significant market for it, albeit a smaller percentage of the music market than ever before since it first arrived.
I mean, so some of what's impacting that is people actually having something to play it on, whereas with vinyl, people buy vinyl without owning a record player because
but record players are fairly easy to come by these days as well.
They've become a lot cheaper.
We have a massive branch of Lidl around the corner, and they're selling turntables.
Are they really?
And decent turntables.
Oh, really?
Well. Yeah.
Because there was that period of time where I think H&V used to stock like a 99 quid one, and it was a bit bobbins.
Yes. But yeah, it's not hard to come by a turntable. You can't find a bloody cassette deck anywhere. Not that I've tried, but
No, well, I kind of want to task you with that.
I have some cassettes, but I don't have a cassette deck. But they're cassettes that I've had for 35 years or something like that. I see indies opening more often than I see indies closing.
Oh, that's interesting.
It's not to say that.
I mean, given that
it's not to say that there's one a day.
No, but given that the high streets in general are contracting because of online.
Yeah, I think the period of consolidation's taken place, and you could apply that from top to bottom. Mm-hmm. And I've been around for long enough to see that, 20 years ago we had labels that were shipping a release to us by an unknown artist with very little information on an unknown label, and we'd still sell the units we needed to sell to make that financially viable for them. What's happened is there are less chances, less wide boys now, and everyone from labels to retail to distributors has been forced to recognise what's required to make something a success. Mm-hmm. So you now have labels that realise that you need to put the groundwork in, and that a distributor like ourselves can't magic sales on nothing.
Yes.
But that's part of our job to tell them.
Indeed.
So we do that whenever I'm talking to a new label that we're looking to take on. We make it clear to them that this is the foundation you need to have in place in order for us to be able to work this.
Yeah.
And you have stores that the stores that have made a real success. Resident would be an obvious one. Drift being another one down in Devon. Resident in Brighton, if you're unaware, are stores that don't try to spread themselves too thinly. We ask stores to state the genres that are of interest to them when they set up with us, and I'm always a little bit wary of those that mark all genres. That won't work.
No.
You know your audience and cater for your audience.
Absolutely.
And yes, you can dictate your audience to a degree, and that's one of the real benefits of being an indie ahead of, say, Amazon, where you don't have that personal touch, the curation, or not to the same degree anyway. But the indies that have served so well in recent years are those that have a defined vision and involve themselves in stores and putting gigs on in their local towns and creating a mini scene around it. But you can't create an audience that doesn't exist, so don't try to stock everything and see what sells. know what your audience is, and then yes, you can introduce that audience to releases within their field of interest that they might not have been aware of otherwise. But if you've got a town of 50, 60-year-old jazz and folk fans, you're not going to be able to sell techno and drum and bass to them.
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, it's not the same thing, but where I've opened the bar recently, thinking about what we were going to put in it, we spent some time properly thinking about that and looking at, what should and shouldn't be there, but also with the understanding that we might get a few things wrong, and so we'll definitely have to keep an eye on it. But that real estate, if you like, within the bar was so limited, and it's a very similar sort of thing with record shops.
Yeah, you need to put the necessary research in, or at least have the necessary awareness of the immediate surrounds and the market. Yeah,
very good. Okay, I think we're over an hour, which is no surprise at all. Yeah, so I'm gonna quit there, I think. So appreciate your time, Andy. Really do. So to my listeners, thank you for listening. As ever, I welcome all feedback, comments and suggestions for future shows. My Twitter handle is @AlexBranson. Just put podcast DM in a tweet and I will follow you back and we'll have a direct dialogue. But of course, it's probably just easier to go to my website, www.abcmusic.co, where you will find a contacts page with my email address on. Thank you for listening.